Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us at the Microsoft Power BI UK user group. I'm your host Leon Gordon, and as always, we're back for our weekly dose of Power BI knowledge brought to you by a Power BI expert. Now, as always, please do let us know where you're dialing in from. I can see a few of you in the chat, so Gopal Gawali, welcome. Swapnil Palakar, welcome. Vipel Goel, welcome. And of course, we have our speaker with us today, who I will introduce shortly. As always, we want this to be a very interactive session, so please do feel free to ask questions throughout. Let us know where you're joining us from. And as I'm sure you're aware, this has been an absolutely massive week for Power BI with Microsoft Build and the new announcements that have been made recently around data marts, PowerPoint, and other new features which have come to light as well. So please do let us know in the chat and the comments what your favorite features have been off the back of Build. So with that being said, as I mentioned, today's session we're going to look at data visualization with Power BI with my friend James Andrew. It's great to have James with us today. I'll just give a bit of a brief background around James before I hand over to him for his session. So James is a professional business intelligence analyst and content creator based in Scotland within the UK. And he originally got hooked on Power BI through supply chain projects within the oil and gas industry. He decided to pursue his newfound love of Power BI, Python and SQL and all things data. And James is also the founder of Matador Software, where he creates YouTube tutorials focusing on data analysis and business intelligence. And I do recommend that you do go and subscribe to James's YouTube channel because his content on, as we mentioned, Power BI, SQL and Python is amazing. So James, absolutely amazing to have you with us today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen and you can let me know, Leon, if there's any issues throughout.
No problem at all.
All right, so we'll get this presentation started. Does that look good, Leon?
Perfect.
Perfect. All right, so yeah, as Leon said, I'll maybe give you slightly more depth of information about me. So I'm a business intelligence analyst by day, and by night and any other hour that I have, I tend to be fairly active on LinkedIn and YouTube, providing content on business intelligence and data, general principles, data visualization, SQL, Python, automation. I'm all about that. I'm based in Scotland in the United Kingdom, and I previously worked in supply chain and consulting. And what I think is really interesting about that is that you tend to find, especially people who are just breaking into business intelligence, they maybe aren't very sure about a specific route you should take. Well, most people I've encountered come through something like supply chain, finance. It's not necessarily through a computer science background because it's very different. And they get involved in Power BI and the technology and get hooked from there. As well as that, I'm a dad, a partner, and a lifelong learner. And I think with all of us being enthusiastic about this industry, unfortunately, we have resigned ourselves to being lifelong learners. So, moving forward to our agenda for today. So we are speaking about data visualization within Power BI. So to start off with, we're going to look at data visualization principles and some examples of literature. And I want to sort of take you down the foundations and the history maybe, to make it a bit more of an interesting insight, because we need to remember that Power BI is the tool we use now, but these principles have been built on really solid foundations, and actually they're not anything new. Choosing the right chart, we'll look at some of that and some really interesting real world use cases. These are things that excite me as well. So we'll be looking at an example from Fox News, from storytelling with data, and we'll be looking at Steve Jobs' infamous 3D pie chart at the Macworld keynote in 2008. After that, I want to go into the Gestalt Principles of design, give you a bit more depth of knowledge to really help power up your reports within Power BI, help end users, stakeholders, and generally make everything more enticing and appealing. We'll then look at giving your data a voice. And then we're going to go into some hands-on workarounds and creative solutions, as well as some conditional formatting, UNICHAR time-based icons. And to have a bit of fun, round things off at the end, I want to show you a single value emoji slider. And you can take some of these principles, extrapolate them and transfer them yourself. The aim is to finish off in about 45 minutes and leave 15 minutes for question and answer session. So that's how I think it'll go. As Leon said, we will block off some time at the end for questions and answers. However, if I am going over a certain topic and you have a burning question at that point, please feel free to ask, and Leon will let me know there. So again, we said that data visualization is built on old foundations essentially, and it's very true. So when you go into sort of literature around business intelligence, Power BI, data analysis, whatever that may be, you tend to find that if you want to know something about data modeling, you might go to Kimball or Inman. And if you want to know something about data visualization, you may go to Edward Tufte or Stephen Few or people like that. And what's actually remarkable, this book was published in 1983, and this is an example of an illustration in 1981 by the New York City weather for 1980, and it's from the New York Times. But what we actually see here is the principles for good visualization remain the same despite the massive time difference. So, you know, even the sort of a line chart here is reminiscent of error bars that have been sort of released in Power BI recently, and obviously been in Excel for some time. We've got things like narration that's present there. The scale's pretty good. We've got bar charts, we've got line charts, and all sort of stacked on top of each other. But I do find it quite amazing that we've a lot of the principles that we would identify as good principles now are perfectly congruent with this visualization. So I would say that it's really important to remember that we need to stick to these foundations whenever we're looking at data visualization. And these are going to help us as we move forward and take this full circle and look at how these are relevant in Power BI. So I tend to find sort of tidbits like this really interesting. And to give you a second example of old foundations, this is supposedly one of the first examples of an area chart, like you would see in Power BI nowadays. And it's by William Playfair, who's considered one of the founders of sort of data visualization. And it charts the imports and exports to and from England between 1700 and 1782. But again, if I'm going to point out some important features, we've got a great title. We don't have axis labels, but we do have at the bottom, we have a great description. So we've got a bit of narration coming through already. As we saw, we can see it's multi-series area chart, and the area between the two curves shows the difference between them. And it's a great representation of the balance of trade. So again, the things that you're not going to find this in your computer graphics, but it's very similar and the principles remain the same, even dating back to 1700. So I would implore you to look at some of these items, whether it's on Google, whether you go look at some of these older books, and we're going to go through some more examples as we follow on right up until a hands-on demonstration with Power BI and our current time. So there are some principles of data visualization. And WWTD, what would you have to do? I think that's a pretty good place to start. But it does come from a slightly more academic standpoint. So after this, we're going to break down some more relevant and modern concepts, maybe. And this extract on the right is taken from his book and the principles of graphical excellence, specifically what we're looking at. And important to note here, before we go into the items on the left, we've got graphical excellence is nearly always multivariate, so made of multiple variables. And the key item here that should underpin everything we do requires telling the truth about the data. And as we move forward, we're actually going to look at some examples where even if you have the best intentions of telling the truth, if you don't visualize your data correctly or stick to some of these founding principles we're looking at, it's very easy to be unconsciously biased or deceptive. And that's a whole issue in itself. So if we were to sum up some of Tufte's principles of graphical excellence, we want to induce the viewer to think about the substance of the findings rather than the methodology the graphical design, or other aspects. Very relevant when we're using Power BI. People don't need to know how we did the things that we did. And quite often what you find is that even the most complex data sources or reports that look like they were going to be incredibly complex, if you can make them look very simple, then most likely that's where the hardest reports were. Most of your work went into making complex data look very simple. Again, avoid distorting what the data has to say. So we're going to look at some of these principles. When you're labeling axis, do you start from zero? Have you unintentionally skewed the axis labels so that there's a bit of a lie factor there? And lots of similar items, depending how we present things, it can almost be deceptive. Present many numbers efficiently, absolutely, and make large data sets coherent. Well, that's more relevant now, um, especially with some new announcements from Microsoft, than it ever has been. We want to encourage the eye to compare different pieces of data, and I'm going to take you through some very interesting pieces about how the eye moves around dashboards, reports, canvas pages, etc. We want to reveal the data at several levels of data, from a broad overview to the fine structure. So what you usually get, let's say if we work in an organization and we're using Power BI, is we may have an end user or a stakeholder that comes to us and they want to see a snapshot of overall figures. Great, that's what you want to do, maybe if you have 10 seconds in the day. But we need to give people the function to go away, drill down, scope, and get to the correct granularity of data that they may require. So that may be down to a specific salesperson or practitioner level, or a specific product ID, transactional level. So important to think about. And of course, we need to serve a clear purpose, because if we're purely putting information on a dashboard, what does it mean? If there's no purpose, it doesn't really mean anything. So we really need to be careful around how we do that. And I'm just going to open up this laptop here. So moving on, we went through quite an academic point, I guess. Um, we said we wanted to look at some of the Chufta's principles. Now, if I actually want to break this down to something that you may remember and be able to take away with you, simple, standard, and scalable, I think is a very good catchphrase that you could use to underpin sort of your data visualization. So if we were to take a Power BI use case for the above, in terms of simple, like I said, and this would tie in with these really old foundational principles, refine your Power BI report by removing all redundancy. We don't, and a really great way to do this, we said the simplest looking reports are usually most difficult to develop. Well, you could wireframe. And when we talk about wireframe in a Power BI report, potentially you've got a schematic from someone or an idea from a stakeholder as to what you should be doing. Great. Now you can go ahead and design how everything's going to function, and you're going to get from that broad overview right down to a good level of granularity. Now, the easiest way to remove redundancy is to get the things we think we need on dashboards or reports and basically take everything away until we're just left to what we need. So if you come to the conclusion that on a dashboard, let's say you have a scatter plot, if you come to the conclusion that you can remove this and it doesn't actually affect your message, your other visualizations, or what you're trying to convey or force people to do with this data, then you've removed a redundant piece of information. And that's a really good way to do it. Take everything away until it starts to hurt the overall message or your report. Standard. So one way that you could take this, obviously, if you're working on reporting, you want things to be standardized, and that obviously goes from a level of the font that you use. Let's say you're using Lato or Calibri, whatever that may be. You may have a way it's standardized where the title's used in bold. We work down to a slightly smaller font and italics maybe for instruction, and the colors represented across axis and graphs, whatever that may be. We want to make sure that's standardized. It's very important, and it does have more of an effect on the human brain than you think. But also, I think if you're in a Power BI or a BI organization and you use Power BI, a really important thing to think about with standardization is how do we maintain this across a whole team? That's also very important. So you don't want to be given stakeholders reports that look very different the whole time. We want to get some form of familiarity with changes dependent on what they want to see. So that's really, really important, I would say. And scalable. So do your visualizations and reports grow with the business systems and data that we have available? Well, I think that's a very good question, because especially if you join an organization in its infancy, then systems are going to become more advanced. You may go from importing data with SharePoint and things which isn't the most effective, or Excel, and suddenly you have, Azure SQL, and you're direct querying data or importing data that way. Well, can we ensure that what we're creating from the offset is going to grow with the business system as the strategy becomes more mature? So we need to make sure at every point things are simple, standard, and scalable. Now, here's something I find very interesting. The principles of data visualization, and we're looking at how to grab an end user's attention. So this is based on studies. Some of this is based on actually quite a large study that Tableau did, obviously a competitor with Power BI, but if you're going to trust a study from someone, it's likely going to be an organization such as themselves. So one of the most important things that we do as humans, well, I'm speaking from the UK, we read from left to right. These principles can be reversed to the other side if you read from right to left in your country. But we want to cater to a reading pattern, and humans will read in an F. So as you can see here, we have these yellow lines that sort of demonstrate how a human reads on a page, and you can see that the associated blocks in the dashboard, um, depending on the intensity of this sort of white and the transparency, you can see that the upper left corner is the most valuable piece of real estate. So if you're going to catch someone's attention, you better make sure that whatever's up there, and usually you will find that it's maybe the page on the dashboard, a key figure. You don't really want to have a logo there, would you? Because you're sort of, if I took my Matador software, if this was just a concept and put my logo there, then we're almost wasting a vital piece of real estate. And this could actually dramatically harm someone's buy-in in the organization if they want to look at our reporting. Now, you'll see here as well, I said we read in an F. So if we take this as the F shape, the letter F, we see that the important sectors again just conform towards that. So in the bottom right corner, there's not really anything there because humans don't read. Um, it's just not catered towards taking in information that way. So really, this block here, these four items are going to be your key space. And also down at the bottom left does tend to be an important point, and the top right. The rest is sort of tertiary in nature, with these items being secondary. So we're going to get into some of the ways you can alter this almost by following a specific format. So maybe you present your dashboards within a triangular format or column, and we can sort of reprogram the way that people see this. But it's a pretty safe bet that you want to have your important information within these four blocks towards the top left, and anything else that's secondary in nature can follow. And the use of size and color is universal. But that doesn't mean to say that we want to overuse size or color either. We want it to be very specific. So I'm a great believer in the power of narration in helping end users, and not over cluttering things. So here we've got product sales highlighted um, within a bold font and increased in size in 2021, decreased. And now, because red's a universal sign of something that's alarming or bad, we've immediately caught the user's attention. I didn't need to focus on anything else. My brain gravitates towards that sense of color. And beside that, I noticed that, all right, 250% is bold. So this must mean something significant. And from there, we see the red, which highlights decrease. And you can see how your brain puts things together. But at the same time, we could have highlighted product sales in another color. But in my opinion, in such a small piece of text, that's actually going to distract the user more. So use that color sparingly for those points that really matter. And another way you might think of that is if you're using a bar chart, of category sales. A lot of people might choose to display all the bars in a gray sort of color, and the key item would be in maybe a dark green or red. Again, it's a way of grabbing attention very quickly and just quickly getting the human eye to that point. And we want to think about these things. And I know a lot of it seems like, I think it can go from one extreme to the other. Either you're looking into this too much, or, a lot of this is common sense, but either way, it's important. Now, we included some top tips that actually came from some of the related studies. Um, Titles and narration are hugely important. And one thing that's really valuable that I read that came out of a Tableau study is to do the squint test on titles. And that would mean that when you squint your eyes slightly, you should still be able to make out a title fully of a certain graphic. So we'll look into this sort of concept later. If you can't, then likely you need to refine your title size and make it larger. And the 10-second rule. So really, when an end user looks at a report, we've got to remember that we're trying to force something to happen with the data. Um, and we've really got about 10 seconds to capture someone's opinion, capture someone's attention, even if they requested this report. So that's important. And obviously, you can check how long people are on this. So if you go into the Power BI service, you can actually get usage metrics. You can get an API to create your own bespoke usage metrics, where you can track everything in a workspace and how often people are going to spend time on them. So that's a good way to check and verify that your data visualization is working. Because if someone's asked for a report and you make it too cluttered, and I'm the same. If I see something that's very full of color and very full of different tables, that could be visually layered, I'm likely not going to spend a lot of time in that report, and I'll probably just give up. And I think humans are the same. So you want to ensure that you can really capture people's attention within 10 seconds. And some of these foundational pieces of information I've went over, I hope these are starting to take effect and you're starting to see how you could piece these together to do that. So moving on. Now, excuse the slightly small text here. There's a lot of information to get in, but I don't want to get in the habit of just reading off a screen. So one of the key sort of thought processes or principles of data visualization is this Gestalt Principles. And while I'm speaking, you can feel free to look here. Um, this logo actually does a great job of almost conveying what each of these principles means. But I'm going to look over them, and I find this very interesting, and I hope you will too. So closure is one of the key principles, and this is the idea that your brain will fill in the missing parts of a design or image to create a whole. Now, the reason I've got the World Wildlife Fund logo here is this is an excellent example of that. You can see that the panda, the white, actually, it's nothingness. It isn't actually a piece of the design, it's blank space or negative space, but our brain will fill in missing parts of a design. So it's very important to remember when you're doing anything in Power BI with data visualization. That's a key principle. Now we can see common fate represented in the E here, and it states that people will group together things that point to or are moving in the same direction. Now I do find the law of continuity very interesting. It states here, we can see it with continuation, that the human eye will follow the smoothest path when viewing lines, regardless of how they were drawn. So you can see that this straight path through the S is always going to be the simplest way for the human to follow a specific pattern. So it's something that you should bear in mind if you are using things that are complex. Maybe you have scatters, slope graphs, you've got custom visualizations. I am a great believer also that custom visualizations are great, but you can do a lot with native visuals, polished design, and narration. You can pretty much do anything within Power BI. So important to remember that. Now, similarity and symmetry are sort of very similar. You can see here, essentially what you're saying is that elements are visually grouped regardless of their proximity to each other. And that could be by color, shape, or size. And they tend to be perceived as a unified group. And figure and ground is quite similar to closure. And you can see a great example here within the A. It takes advantage of how the brain processes negative space. So that negative space or that omission of data or visuals is actually very important in how we process things and grab people's attention. And again, proximity is very, again, a huge principle and probably something we do all the time. Um, and we see here, we use it to get users to group certain things together without hard borders. Now, in design, often hard borders are very harsh and can look a bit crass. So by putting things closer together, the viewer starts to lump chunks. So for example, I could have a slicer pane. I don't have a hard border. I've got a line graph. I've got 3 cards, and that would be a very basic design with maybe an information panel. Um, but the user can, we talked about viewing things in an F. They can sort of rewire to go, all right, okay, so James is showing me a slicer pane. I've got my key time related graphic in my line graph where I can view sales by whatever, by year or quarter, and so on. So it's these things are hugely important and probably things that you may do instinctively largely, but some maybe not. So I actually want to move into some real world data visualization. And this is actually an example from Storytelling with Data. I would recommend you to go and get this book, and it takes pride of place in many bookshelves. And I would say if Tufte's visual display of quantitative information, this would be the modern sort of equivalent. Now, when I say what's wrong with that bar chart, you could say, well, not much, okay, but I'm gonna show you something. So Fox News here have what they've done is they've started the main issue here. They've started the axis at 34% and they've finished the axis at 42. It's not 0 to 100. Um, so the issue here is that where actually, you know, if we were viewing at home, 35 and 39%, I believe that's 39%, isn't actually a huge difference. And it's not a reason for us to get hugely, hugely worried over tax. But what they successfully do here, or unsuccessfully really, because it's deceptive, is people start to think just by looking at those 2 data points, wow, there's a big issue here. And suddenly I buy into someone's agenda and I'm misinformed in the data because they've presented an axis wrongly. Like probably reading between the lines, we can say that was deliberate. But something that's very important to note when you present data, you need to have an axis that actually portrays the data correctly. Otherwise, this is just useless because it doesn't actually tell me anything relevant. Another few things I would note here, and we know this is on television, it's a bit older, um, but if we were to take these foundational principles, um, if Bush tax cuts expire, not a great title. It doesn't really tell me anything. And top tax rate, again, you could be a lot more descriptive. And we have all of this information here that just tends to confuse people. So I'm already in a state where I'm quite confused, and I suddenly just see 2 huge bars. I probably don't take in those small data labels, and suddenly there's an issue in my head, and my whole perception of Bush's tax cuts, whatever that may be, does change. And that's important. This is a foundational no-no. We just can't do this. So I wanted to take an example from Power BI. I just cooked this up myself in Power BI and brought it in here. Now, some items of a good column chart and bad column chart. We'll start with the bad. And to be honest with you, I actually see bar charts or column charts like this all the time. And that's fine. That's fine. But going by foundations and principles, it's not great. The first thing we have here is we have a title that could be much better. It's also not aligned. It's very crammed towards our visual. So you could actually just compensate for this with a text box. You could even just take the standard title and align it in the center and make it something a bit more descriptive. Category sales by category name is okay, but what you probably are then going to rely on is these axis labels. Now, I don't know about you, but when I sort of wince when I see these axis labels that are um, orientated the wrong way, they're orientated vertically, because again, it requires the user to take more time to actually piece together what that means. We've got faint grid lines you may not see here, but they're not of real relevance. And you'll notice here that the axis, again, is skewed. So we've got, it starts at 50%, 50K and ends at 80K, whereas this one on the left starts at 0 and ends at 80. And you can see there isn't as huge a deficit as we could force people to believe if we wanted to be quite deceptive. Whereas if we look at this example on the left, we've got view your key product sales by category, and the category is in the same color as the bars. So we suddenly, our brain's starting to piece things together by size and color. And we're giving people an actual option as to what to do. Because again, if I'm given this information on the right, maybe I'm a director and I'm not really sure what they're trying to do here. Great, you've given me some numbers. Well, what do you want me to do? What is my follow-on action? But someone said here, right click on a category bar below to view category sales by salesperson. I go, aha, right. I've got 2 minutes in the morning. Right, I'll drill down. I'll find who my salespeople are who aren't achieving the targets I want them to. Bang, that's their problem now. I've done my 2 minutes in the morning. I've looked at my reporting, and we can make sort of real data-driven decisions and impact through that. And again, we might have something like an icon. In a real case, we might want to let people know what to do, or we could have a tooltip as to how this icon could help. Maybe this could be targets that come up in a tooltip. And suddenly we've got a whole lot of information. It's cleaner. We're actually giving people less to look at pretty much, but a whole lot more insight. Now, I posted on this on LinkedIn recently, but I find it so interesting. Um, and we will never know whether this was actually deceptive. I think we can probably make a fair conclusion. And this infamous 3D pie chart actually led to one of the tech writers from the Guardian newspaper in 2008 calling Steve Jobs, the late Steve Jobs, a snake oil salesman, which obviously isn't a title that you want. So what's wrong with it? Well, and I am not saying here that do not use pie charts. I'm saying that there is a real use case of when you should use them. And if Federico's here, he's a great pie chart enthusiast, and he does it well. So please don't say I'm telling you not to. I'm just saying we need to be careful how we do things. So the main issue here was that by using a 3D pie chart and tilting it, Apple were able to make their market share look bigger than the other, which was actually 21.2%. So we've now got a situation where a 3D pie chart has been layered, tilted, um, and suddenly, again, you may not take note of the actual figures, and Apple just suddenly seemed like more of a world leader in 2008 than they potentially were. We saw that the smartphone market share did tilt anyway, but again, we're being deliberately deceptive, and you would struggle to believe that all that effort went in on a keynote speech to not be deceptive. And we should always try to actually take the biggest values in a pie and layer them coming from clockwise, um, because that way we can distinguish things a bit better. But the truth is, if you really have more than 2 or 3 categories, the human eye really struggles. It's like points on a map, on a moving map. Maybe you really struggle to visualize things as parts of a whole or as segments. This is why we would have been better just using a bar chart. Now, we might not have got the impact if we're Mr. Jobs that we wanted to, but at least we would have been presenting honest information. So really, your bar charts are sort of better by design than pie charts at what pie charts try to do if you've got more than 2 or 3 segments. But it's a very interesting case, and I'd implore you to go and look at it. And the tech publication Wired actually showed how they could rectify this in 2008 as well. So it's not the cleanest imagery. It is from '08, but we can see that. Again, the issue is 19.5 looked bigger than the 21. They corrected the perspective, and they can see that it was distorted. They moved it to the front, they fixed the perspective, and suddenly you can see how honestly now things look very different. So important to note. Now, just because it's a controversial topic, pie charts, good or bad, I'm going to say they're good if you've got a few categories. And to be honest, they're very recognizable. So a lot of end users or stakeholders will ask for them. And you might be able to push back and say, hey, you've got 6 categories. Maybe we can do this. And as a BI analyst, you're sort of too most powerful words might be no or why, but at the end of the day, you're not going to die on a hill over a paycheck regarding a pie chart. So with 2 to 3 categories, and I've seen Federico Pastor, he might be here, use this really well in one of his latest challenges. So yeah, if you've got 2 to 3 categories, great. Now the issue, again, humans aren't great at gauging differences from angles. And when there's similarity in the data, a pie chart makes it difficult to decipher between percentage difference. They're also easy to abuse, like Mr. Jobs showed, especially if you get one of these funky 3D ones in Excel, and applying bias is an issue. And also you might have to apply sort of further labeling to actually make them make sense, which again, you might be able to solve with a bar chart. Now, we're sort of closing up to this sort of more, I guess, theoretical aspect. But giving your data voice is important. So this is actually Microsoft, the examples now, storytelling with data. We saw the Gartner and Microsoft Power BI Bake Off. I think it was Miguel Myers did a great example of data visualization, but this is one of the older examples. And you can see, like I said, with the 10-second rule, with the squinting, with the principles we discussed, like titles, there's overuse of color. It's actually very hard to follow. And if you found my account in some form of Power BI usage metrics in the service, you're probably going to see that I went on this once over a month period. Because what I'm going to do is say, right, you've given me lots of numbers, there's lots of color. It's useless because I don't know what I'm meant to be doing with this. I don't know what it means or what it leads to. What should I be doing? So again, it would just be too much, I think, for most people to follow. And remember, when you're creating reports in Power BI, this could be for people, an engineer could be viewing it, a HR representative, a person in design and marketing, whatever. These people all have different ways that they're used to seeing things. So we need to be able to speak universally to people. Now, just a sample, I spoke about not keeping icons in the top left, but I just wanted to show that this is almost like taking like a web-like user interface, a web app, and bringing it into Power BI. But what we can show here is we've got narration, we've got clear titles. If we do a squint test, we definitely pass on this sort of title. We're showing people where it's from, your company targets, and you can click here to view your PDF invoice. We're giving people action in how to do things, to view your latest invoicing targets. And again, we're showing the 3 invoicing things that we're trying to focus on. And in the full report, there would be an option to drill down into levels of granularity and really get the information that we require. Now, what we're going to do, go into some just hands-on demos with these foundations. I find very interesting, but what I find the most interesting of all is that they just haven't changed. So it's really important to be clued up on those, and more important than I think you, especially if you just start off with Power BI, you think, right, this is a drag and drop tool. I can make it look nice, but remember, if things look nice and they're very colorful and creative, it doesn't always mean that they're going to entice end users. So we need to be careful. Now, let's look at some items in my Power BI desktop on conditional formatting, UNICHAR time-based icons, and again, we'll go into sort of single value emoji slider just because it's fun. It's not hugely practical, but some of these concepts you will really be able to take away with you. So I'm going to come out of here and go into Power BI desktop. And Leon, can you confirm that you can still see my screen, even though I've changed into Power BI desktop?
Yes, we can indeed.
Great. Okay, so we said, so conditional formatting is going to be one of your key tools in Power BI, but I'm not going to teach you to suck eggs. I'm going to assume that a lot of people here know how conditional formatting works. If we were to do a quick run through, you could select, I've just got a table here, for simplicity, any field you want, you could click on the down arrow within the build visual tab here, and you could go into conditional formatting and choose what you want. But I'm going to sort of talk about some of the principles that I think we should still be carrying over into our conditional formatting. Because if I was to show you one thing that I frequently see is, and again, if this works for you, fine, but I may see freight cost, and let's say maybe we have some data bars applied here, and we'll keep that there. Right, we'll chuck those in, great. And then we have sales. So I've, let me just adjust this back. Sales may have conditional formatting as well. And this time we have a background color, and we've got maybe a rule where if the value is greater than or equal to, I can't remember what my actual sales were, but let's say 2000 and less, and I'll just put an arbitrary number. That may be 100,000, then we give that color. And what happens, obviously the text isn't shown, but the best way that I can describe this is things just start to look like a Crayola drawing. And I think it is by virtue of the fact that conditional formatting's been around a long time in Excel, and people see it as a good way to sort of demonstrate change. But we need to be very, or items that need to be flagged, but we need to be very careful. So what I would say is two things that I would recommend when conditional formatting, because we're going to eradicate a lot of the principles that we focused on before if we overdo it. So I'll remove all conditional formatting, and I'll do the same in sales here quickly. Here we go. Now there's really two ways that you will power up your conditional formatting, in my opinion, whilst pertaining to good data visualization principles. Number one, I would say icons are a fantastic way to do it because it's very specific. So we said that, you know, company targets are sales and freight costs. So, okay, this is what we actually want to do things with. This is where we want to draw people's eyesight. So icon might be a great way to do that. And let's just say we're obviously low on time. If the value is greater or equal, we'll say number in sales to 50,000. Again, just an arbitrary number, and less than this number, then we could add a specific icon. So let's do a red flag because that's a universal. Well, red flag, it's in our language. And here what we're doing is obviously I've put in an arbitrary figure, but by being very sparing with our conditional formatting, we can actually draw people's attention very specifically to the points we want. So that was sales. I will remove that. And obviously, you can then go into DAX, and DAX conditional formatting opens up a whole world of possibilities. If we were to use it on freight costs, I've got my measure table here. You can see I've got freight costs over 20K, a measure where I just declare a variable. If you're not familiar with variables, they're just ways to store data, which is just, I'm not using this sum universally because it's a demonstration, so I wouldn't create a separate measure. But I've got the sum of freight cost, and I return if the sum of freight cost is greater than 20,000. We'll make red, otherwise black, because it will blend in, because I'm going to use this as the background color. So I could take my freight cost again, go in here, and conditional formatting, and I could use this for background color. And then when I go into format style, I can click my field value in my measure table, and now I can apply that. And this is just the very basics of the conditional formatting, but I would say that you might want to use this as the text instead of the background, but this then opens up a whole world of possibilities. So another really interesting thing, if we move on into conditional formatting, is that we can use UNICHAR icons. Well, what are UNICHAR icons? I can tell you. If you go to W3 School's a great resource if you're learning SQL, Python, whatever. Power BI allows us to import UNICHAR icons through DAX. And you can actually get, let's say, an icon, you get a figure, 9728 would be a sun, 9733 would be a star, and so on. So what I could do is I can actually write a DAX measure that I've prepared just due to the sort of time limit imposed on us. And I've created a conditional time UNICHAR icon. So again, I create a variable just stating the current hour in 24-hour format. And what this does, it'll take the hour from my system, hour now, simple function. And I return basically an if statement, but switch just allows you to have more options easily. So if statements core to everything we do. If raining, take jacket. It's much the same here. If the hour is greater than or equal to 6 a.m. 06 and less than 12, we're going to provide the UNICHAR 9728. So that would be the sun. And again, we could have more. That's why I have more lines. You could have clouds or whatever. I don't know. But between 12 and 5, it's also daytime. So we have the sun. If the hour is not in those boundaries, so nighttime, you would have a star. So if we actually pull this measure into a card here, and it's this one, conditional time, you can see that it takes our system time. This last refreshed isn't important. It's because I imported it from SQL, this data on another device. Um, and we could actually format this. We could take off the category label. We could take off the background, and we could then format our icon, call out value here, and then there we go. We could, and this is actually taking conditional formatting to the next level, sort of same principles, and we could have a more personal greeting. You could have it based on the user signed into the system. So good evening, and that's star James or Leon or whoever, and we could go from there. Now, one other interesting thing I wanted to show you, and I got this from BI Elite, Parker Stevens, if you haven't checked him out. Another interesting thing that we can do, and again, you're probably never really going to use this because it throws up its own issues in that if we were asking users how they found reports, we would have to have a mechanism of storing those responses somewhere. But I'm hoping you can take some of these principles away with you. So what I've got here is a slider, and in the Power BI service, you wouldn't see this pop up. It would be layered so that people could move this single value slider and select emojis. And I'll show you how to import the emojis very easily and format this slider quickly. So if I was just to remove this here, and I will also remove the slider, this will only take a few minutes and we'll get onto some questions. I'm going to delete this emoji feedback table from my model and start again. That should go. So the single value slider as well is something that's sort of hidden away. So the way that I get this is I can go to modeling, a new parameter, and I'll select a numeric range. And I will call this parameter emoji feedback. There we go. And it's going to be a whole number. And I'm going to assign values between 1 and 5. And this will become apparent as to why I've done this as we go along. We're going to increment it up in steps of 1. So, and by default, it'll add a slicer. And this is how we can get a single value slicer here. Great. Step 1 done. Emoji feedback. And you'll see as I move it along here, again, this we would hide this in the Power BI service, but it'll display which step it's on. Now, if I go into the modeling tab here and click on emoji feedback, you'll see that the DAX behind it generated a series 1 to 5 with a 1 increment. I can add a calculated column here, a new column. And what I could do is type in, what will I name this? I'll name this emoji. See, and it would help if I could type. So we'll call this emoji. And what we'll do, we'll start a switch statement. Again, just like an if switch, and we'll say if true, and we'll go down. And this is sort of a really interesting thing. So we can say emoji feedback, where this emoji feedback column here is equal to 1, then we will include an emoji. Now, if you didn't know how to add an emoji in through a DAX script, you actually just press your Windows icon and period or full stop, and we could add in something that's relevant to 1. So let's say 1's not a good score, and we will just simply copy and paste, Control C, and pardon me that will happen. And let me see, there we go. I will Control V down here, get everything sorted, and then we can go back in and quickly select some emojis. So again, if you press Windows and full stop for a score of 2, which still isn't great. We could have that sort of face, and a score of 3. We will go ahead and take in thinking face. We're not quite sure, it's maybe average. And here we go, big smiley face for 4, that's a pretty good score. And for 5, we can round this off quickly. And Windows, and we could have a nice love heart emoji in the eyes. So there we go, that should be fine. And we can take away that. And there we go, we've now got an emoji within our column through DAX. So we can go back here, we can take in a card. Oh, pardon me, I was selected on the slicer. I will select a card, and I can bring in this emoji column, and you're going to see, because we're on 3, this will dynamically change. So I can quickly take off my category label. I can bring my callout value right up to maybe 60. There we go. And shrink this down a little bit. Bring this in front. And as I say, if we maintain the layer order in our formatting, this will not show in the Power BI service, the value that will pop up here. And again, we can go ahead, and we've now imported emojis. We've got a single value slicer. Again, if you did want to store this, you would need to have a separate mechanism, but very, very good use case, and hopefully take something from that. So we've went over data visualization principles, why they're important, taking that into some Power BI tips with conditional formatting, UNICHAR, whatever that may be, rounded it up with something a bit fun. And I guess as long as you remember some of the things that we've went over and the fact that the foundations are still more important than ever, you'll be okay. So I'm going to hand you back to Leon.
Excellent. Absolutely fantastic session there, James. So thank you very much for going through that for us. It's absolutely been fantastic to see everybody dialing in. I'm just going to put a few on the screen. We've had people dialing in from India, St. Albans, again, Cyprus, Wolverhampton, Uganda as well, and obviously some from USA as well. So very much an international session today. And like I say, the content that you put across today, James, was fantastic, and hopefully some good tips and tricks there as well for some of our users. Now, with that being said, we're going to go on to a few questions. So first and foremost, this question is around the use of backgrounds and shapes. So what would you recommend in terms of layout and design of backgrounds within Power BI?
Very good question. And I think I have used them before. I think the issue with backgrounds themselves is quite often, depending how much they stand out, let's say if it's a background image, you then have to sort of overlay things, get transparency right so that it's not too powerful. And sometimes that can take away from the actual image or data or visualization that you're showing. My personal preference is to find a good color palette somewhere, maybe online. You can do it on tools like Google, and work on sort of using shapes and shadow to sort of highlight key areas. I would prefer that. But I have seen backgrounds done very well. I do think, though, when you start building more complex reports, it gets quite tough to maintain.
Excellent, thank you. And our next question comes in from Favored, and they ask, how can someone get into the career of business analysis or business intelligence analysis with an academic business background to stand out compared to someone for science, for example?
Yeah, great question, and I think it's one that's very pertinent. I would point out that it depends where you are geographically, but there's a huge demand for people who are strong and data literate, and can show these skills. So the way that I've always said to people is to try and have a mechanism for people to find you. So for me, one thing that I did when I was consulting was obviously started this YouTube journey. And it wasn't easy because I'm actually quite an introvert when I'm not doing this sort of stuff. But putting your name out there brought me consulting clients, it brought me people. And that was never what I intended to do. I just want to share my knowledge with people. But it proved that if you have an ability to, you've got Novi Pro now, You've got data challenges like Leon has. You can build a portfolio online. You can build a YouTube channel. You can post on LinkedIn. My preference would be to bring people to me. But even if I'm applying for jobs through a recruitment agency or something, at least I can say, hey, here's my portfolio. Hey, did you know I created a Power BI portfolio like Jocelyn Riviera did on LinkedIn? And yeah, basically get people to notice you and come to you is my strongest advice. And it just means getting yourself out there.
Fantastic advice, James. Thank you for that. Our next question comes in from Gopal Gawali, and they ask what type of narration should be given for visuals.
Yeah, very good question. I think it obviously depends on the visual that you've got, but one thing I always employ is that if you maybe have 3 horizontal bar charts in a line on a dashboard, well, we can make that one, and we can employ some sort of visual layering. So you could have a button that has a bookmark that shows 3 different bar charts within one, essentially. But you need to be able to show people how to navigate that. So that's one key area. Narration, maybe, like I said, getting around your report. It may be a specific action, or it may be a follow-on action. So we say that we want a function with our visualizations. So you could tell people where to go to resolve a certain issue if it comes into place. So yeah, that'd be my advice on narration, but it's incredibly powerful.
Thanks, James. And our next question is from Vipul, and he asks, do we have any specific sites to get color palettes?
Very good question. I tend to just really Google, but there's multiple sites for that. Off the top of my head, I'm not entirely sure where I would go. It would depend. Google actually have natively a very good selection of fonts and color palettes, so that's somewhere I may check. But quite often, what I will do is I will take inspiration online on a website or something. I'll take a snip on my snipping tool here of what that color is, and I'll bring it into Power BI or PowerPoint, and I'll use something like the eyedropper tool in PowerPoint and take it from there. So most of mine, I actually try to look around and find inspiration. But if you just Google, you'll find something.
Perfect, thank you. Our next question comes in from Dean Perry. So on the good bar chart versus bad bar chart example, did you use a text box for the good title and subtitle, or is it just a new formatting option on the bar chart visual?
Great question. And no, it's a text box. I know that the title is quite restrictive. Again, if you align and you get the text right and things, it can look good, but really it's not going to cost you much performance costs with the rendering to just have a text box, and it gives you so much more power, and the end user will appreciate that. So it's just a slight trade-off there.
Thank you for clarifying that for us. Our next question comes in from Sidesh, and they say, hey James, can you elaborate on the difference between a single data visualization versus a full dashboard, and what are the key differences to consider while storytelling?
Yeah, so I mean, a single data visualization usually would form part of what people would consider a dashboard. We might call a report page, and then Power BI, your report would be, like we said in that foundational principle, going from an overview right down to a specific layer of granularity. So let's say within a data visualization or a few, we can have that one very clean piece of data and some narration. But when you're within a report, you need to be very careful about where you're leading people. So if I give you a time period line graph where I show sales over years, what do I then want users to do? How do I want them to drill down? Do I give them buttons to change into bookmarks, to choose selected dates, to drill down into salespeople, all these things. So I would say the key difference is when you're using a report, you really need to be ahead of the game and thinking about where you want to drive users with your visualization and what you make them do.
Excellent, great answer. Thank you for that. And let's move on to our next question. Sorry, just bear with me a moment. Okay, let's go with, do you need to master Excel VBA coding first to be comfortable with the DAX coding part?
Absolutely not. No, I've dabbled in VBA. One thing that you'll find is Power Query can be a great alternative. What I would say is if you do want to have a foundational, something that will really help you in DAX, I've found that Transact SQL scripts and SQL Server will help. But you can learn these concepts as you go. There's people on YouTube who break it down very well. Like Kurbal had her DAX Friday series, or you can go straight into some of the books like The Definitive Guide to DAX, which are a bit heavier. But I don't think you need any prerequisite, because it's what you're doing. It's a functional programming. So you're just piecing together things. It's essentially a bit like Lego blocks. So you do not need to dive into VBA at all.
Excellent, thank you very much. Our next question comes in from Gopi, and they ask custom visuals versus default visuals, your preference and the reason for this preference.
Very good question. Default visuals for me, and there's a few reasons. Number one, custom visuals can be problematic if they've got a price tag, because then you would have to ensure that your organization, and I am not discounting them, there's a lot of great, but in a business environment, it's hard to convince directors and other companies to pay these subscriptions. I think with default visuals as well, they tend to be very standardized and clear, so people are familiar with them already. And then we polish them up, we add our narration, and they're incredibly powerful in themselves. And I think sometimes when you get into the world of custom visualizations, it becomes a bit of a downward spiral, and we tend to want a lot of them, and it looks a bit clunky. But I'm not discounting them. There's some that I still use, but in a business environment, it does become a bit problematic.
Excellent. Thank you for your perspective there, James. Our next question comes in from Jas, and they ask, which is the best chart for comparison data points?
Comparing data points, well, one of your best is actually going to be the bar chart, like we said. It's a lot more powerful than most would care to admit, and it gives you a really good insight into that drill down function and getting to a specific level of granularity. And like I said, it's familiar, it's universal.
Excellent, thank you. And the last question for us for this evening comes in from Dean Perry, and he asks, does your approach of having navigation buttons on the left of the report canvas change if the report is being published as an app where there is already a navigation sidebar?
Yeah, absolutely. To be honest with you, that would change just dependent on the report, and it depends what sort of organization you're in. If you're doing it on your own, you've got complete freedom. Maybe you've got a standardized approach with an organization and some sort of branding. It really is just dependent on the situation itself. And like we said, if we're reading things in the F, that example was just to show that we could take a web app based design. Um, but if we're reading in the F, really, you might want to have a pop out slicer or something so you can get key figures and data on that side anyway. So it's completely ad hoc, in my opinion.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, James. Absolutely amazing session. You can see some of the feedback coming onto the screen now. Vipul's saying it was a really helpful session. Some people are saying it was nice to actually meet you as well, James. Similar to myself, we've actually only ever met virtually, so hopefully we can change that at some point to being in person. Again, everybody saying it was absolutely a fantastic session. So thank you very much for joining us and obviously sharing your insight for us as well.
My pleasure. Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Excellent. And thank you to everybody as well for joining us today. As always, you've been here with the Microsoft Power BI UK user group, and today's session has been brought to you in association with Onyx Data. We will be back next week as well with our Power BI theme session with Adam Aspin, so please do make sure you join us. And you could have been anywhere in the world, but you've been here with us at the Microsoft Power BI UK user group. Stay safe and see you soon.